My presentation today will be basically talking about the experimental evaluation of an NCOFDM transceiver. It's a secondary NCOFDM transceiver, and we'll be using this secondary transceiver for coexistence experiments with primary systems. This is basically the outline of the presentation today. Firstly, I'll be going over the introduction to cognitive radios, as Professor mentioned, and how these cognitive radios can be utilized in dynamic spectrum access experiments. And then we'll move on to the design of the secondary OFDM transceiver, which is designed with the LTE specification in mind. And then we'll move on to the hardware and real-time implementation of this transceiver. And we'll talk about the constraints that a real-time system brings into the picture when we're talking about such an implementation. And then we'll conclude with some experimental results. So I'm going to brush through the introduction fairly quickly because this work has been going on for a while now. So we know that with non-availability of spectrum or scarcity of spectrum today, there's a lot of, and with new wireless technologies being brought up every day, there's a severe demand for spectrum, and because of inefficient usage of the allocated spectrum, this calls for better spectrum allocation policies. So there are two kinds of spectrum allocation policies, the static and the dynamic kind, and it can be seen that the dynamic kind is more advantageous because it allows for coexistence of multiple radio systems within the radio environment. So just a brief introduction to what coexistence actually means. So when we are talking about primary and secondary systems coexisting in the same radio environment, we mean that the primary users here are basically referring to licensed users who have been allocated a certain spectrum to use. The secondary systems are, however, opportunistic systems which basically utilize the radio spectrum based on its availability. So this means that the secondary users in the radio environment need to be efficient enough to function in a way that they don't cause any interference to the licensed primary users. So the block diagram here is a very system level overview of how coexistence actually works. So you've got a primary link going on there, which is a licensed primary transmitter which is functioning. And we have a secondary system which is an opportunistic system which scans the available spectrum and makes use of any bands that are not currently being used by the primary system. We'll talk about how this is done in a couple of slides. So one way to employ such a coexistence scheme is to use specialized software radios called cognitive radios, which are basically smart software radios which change their functioning parameters on the fly depending on the radio environment that it scans. So one objective of a cognitive radio to function as a secondary system is that it does not cause any detrimental interference to the licensed primary users, as I mentioned. So this is just an introduction to the functions of a cognitive radio. I'll just brush through this quickly. So like I said, the cognitive radio has to scan the available spectrum and dynamically change its transmission power and frequencies based on the availability of the spectrum. So moving on to dynamic spectrum access. So what dynamic spectrum access actually means is how a secondary system makes use of the unavailable bands of the radio spectrum. So if you see the three block diagrams here, so the first block diagram refers to the case where the secondary system is turned off if there is a primary transmission happening in the radio environment. Clearly it can be seen that this is causing underutilization of spectrum, and this is basically inefficient. So one way to make the system more efficient is to have a secondary transmission which basically turns off its transmission only in the bands that the primary is present in. So this second block here refers to such a case. So however, when you're talking about multiple such radios functioning in the same radio environment, there is bound to be spectral leakage because of the presence of one over the other. So one way to make an efficient transmission occur is to employ certain interference suppression schemes for the secondary transmission. So the secondary transmission basically is going to select the bands that it senses a primary in and not transmit in those bands. So if we can make sure that these bands which are turned off have some interference suppression occurring in them, and that then it would mean that the primary transmission can occur more efficiently than otherwise. So here's an introduction to the non-contiguous OFDM secondary system. So like I said, turning off the secondary during primary transmission is clearly inefficient. So the one way to make use of the available spectrum by the secondary and the primary to coexist at the same time is to utilize a specialized scheme called the non-contiguous OFDM, which is not, which has been on for a while now. So the non-contiguous OFDM scheme basically nulls out subcarriers in the band where it senses a primary, and this can be done based on a spectral mask. So if you can see the diagram here, the zeros correspond to the subcarriers where there is a primary transmission sense, and the ones correspond to those where there is no primary. And this subcarrier, this carrier mask can be used to set the NC-OFDM transmission. So here's a brief overview of the dynamic spectrum access system. So when there is a quiet period in the radio environment, that is when there is no transmission occurring, then the secondary system can go ahead and make use of the spectrum and transmit a normal OFDM as this flowchart indicates. So so the secondary system has to basically sense the available spectrum, and if there is a primary existence, then it has to switch over to the non-contiguous scheme wherein only subcarriers that the primary is present in are nulled out. If there is no primary existence, it can continue with a regular OFDM transmission. So this block here basically denotes how coexistence actually works. So if you can see on the diagram on the left, so there is a primary link happening in channel 1 and channel 3 at different time intervals. So the secondary link has to just null out the subcarriers where the primary is present, and it can continue transmission in the rest of the bands. So this clearly is more efficient than turning off the secondary when there is a primary sense. So let's talk about what the non-contiguous OFDM setup for DSI was used. So we implemented a primary transmitter using a USRP2, or we had a vector signal generator which basically simulated a wireless microphone signal. So here we have used the wireless microphone signal as a primary transmitter. So the secondary system involved two alternate implementations, as Professor mentioned. So the earlier implementation that I was a part of was based on the USRP2 based GNU radio NC-OFDM transmitter, and the second implementation, which is fairly recent, is based on the National Instruments based real-time embedded controller platform. So interference suppression, as I said, within the notch for the non-contiguous OFDM transmission becomes necessary in order to make the transmission more efficient and have lesser spectral leakage within the notches where the primary transmits. So we've employed a specialized scheme called IAPFT. I'll just talk about it in the next slide. So this IAPFT scheme was suggested by NEC Labs Japan, and so this scheme basically takes care of avoiding or suppressing interference within the notch. So they use two different schemes within the IAPFT system, and these two schemes basically add on to become the IAPFT. So IAPFT basically stands for interference avoidance by partition frequency and time. So if you see the two schemes that they use within the IAPFT are called time windowing and cancellation carriers. I'll just talk about them in the next slide. So the first method that they use in IAPFT is the time windowing scheme. So the time windowing scheme basically concentrates on suppressing the interference within the center of the notch. So this it does by pulse shaping the time domain samples that are generated with a raised cosine filter, and does some cyclic prefix addition and I'll just mention that in the next slide. The carrier cancellation method is taking care of suppressing the interference at the edges of the notch of the secondary NC-OFDM transmission. So this it does by inserting two specially modulated tones at the edge of the notch to cancel the leakage happening at the edges because of the secondary transmission. So time windowing scheme. So basically, like I said, these two schemes work on parallel streams of data, and they both combine to form the NCOFDM signal with IAPFT introduced. So the time window scheme basically adds the cyclic prefix so basically it adds the head leading symbols of the leading part of the OFDM symbols onto the cyclic prefix and onto the tail, and the trailing part of the OFDM symbol onto the cyclic prefix. So this is done before the pulse shaping step. So once the cyclic prefix addition and the tail addition are done, the the symbols are converted to time domain by taking an IFFT, and once the time domain samples are obtained, the pulse shaping is done by multiplying these time domain samples by raised cosine filter. So after the pulse shaping, the tail part of the symbols are added to the cyclic prefix of the next symbol. So this basically forms the time windowed portion of the signal. Moving on to the second technique in IAPFT, it is the carrier cancellation scheme. So like I said, there are two specially modulated tones introduced at the edges of the notch for carrier cancellation. These CC tones are basically computed using the 10 subcarriers to the 10 neighboring subcarriers from the notch, and they're computed using the intercarrier interference matrix, which is basically supplied for a particular NCFDM system with a fixed FFT size and so on. So this is just a summarizing slide for how the IPFT scheme works. So like I said, they work on parallel streams of data. So the top branch here is taking care of the time windowing aspect, and the bottom branch does the carrier cancellation. And these two combine to form the NCFDM with IAPFT transmission. So like I said, this was the initial implementation of the DSI setup. So the primary system was a wireless microphone signal, was simulated using a VSG. The secondary system was an LTS implementation with the following parameters, and this was implemented on the USRP2. And this was the scheme that we utilized earlier, and we have this was done along with two ex-students of WinLab who were earlier doing their masters here, and we got a paper accepted and published at this conference using this setup. So the second setup that we are discussing about today is the LTE standard-based NCFDM scheme. This is based on the real-time platform, basically. So the objective was to develop such a scheme on the real-time platform based on the LTE standards that are specified here, which was a transmission bandwidth of 20 megahertz. This relates to a sampling frequency of 30.72 megahertz, and the number of occupied subcarriers that it specifies is 1200. So such high bandwidth schemes basically place demands on the system when it comes to time constraints and certain blocks supposed to complete at particular time intervals. So this is just summarizing the parameters that we used for our NCFDM implementation. So we used an FFT size of 2048 and a cyclic prefix length of 512. So, like I said, this real-time platform allows for a robust implementation or robust design platform, which makes use of certain real-time modules and the available FPGA hardware within this platform. So, when we are talking about such real-time and FPGA implementations, we obviously mean that this is going to be efficient as opposed to a software-based implementation, because the FPGA circuitry basically functions at a much more efficient and a faster rate as opposed to a normal software-based implementation. So this platform allows for these three implementation types. So one of the ways is to do a host-only implementation, which is basically a simulation of the entire system. There can be a real-time controller implementation, which basically means that the system can be implemented in the real-time platform, and we can also utilize the FPGA hardware that the real-time controller itself houses. So this is the platform overview about how this platform actually works. So the host is connected to the real-time controller via gigabit Ethernet, and the real-time controller, like I said, houses the FPGA module. The FPGA module interfaces to the DAC and the front end. So the front end here we've used is the ETUS XCVR transceivers, which have the following parameters and maximum transmit power.
What was your host machine?
It is a host computer.
Which one do you use?
It's a Windows-based host machine, as in which runs LabVIEW on it. Basically, LabVIEW is the proprietary software for the National Instruments platform. So this sort of a platform basically allows for mapping various sub-blocks of the design onto different platforms, like I mentioned. So the individual blocks can be implemented on different modules present in the system. The communication between the host, the real-time controller, and the FPGA are basically constrained by the timing and the clock requirements of each of these devices. So here we can see that the real-time controller is interfaced to the FPGA inside, and basically in our case, we are talking about generating 12 OFDM symbols per subframe, which is of duration 1 millisecond. So this means that the real-time controller has to basically pump out 12 OFDM symbols per subframe to the FPGA in order to make sure that the FPGA doesn't lose out on data for processing. And the FPGA within itself is working at a much higher rate, and the FPGA, because it interfaces to the DAC, which works at speed of 50 megahertz complex frequency, 50 megahertz frequency, the FPGA has to basically make sure that there are 50 million complex samples that are sent to the DAC for processing. Otherwise, the DAC is going to lose out on the data, and not the execution flow is hampered.
What's the clock speed of your FPGA implementation?
So we used 100 megahertz.
100 megahertz. 100 megahertz, 100 mega samples, 100 megabits.
So 100
is specified.
No, you specify it as the clock frequency. So we specified it as 104 megahertz. Hertz.
So what kind of processing are you doing in the FPGA?
Yeah, I'll just come.
Okay.
So this is just introducing how the development environment within the National Instruments platform. The language used is the LabVIEW programming language, or the LabVIEW FPGA programming language. Like I said, the real-time controller module allows for development of such time-constrained design blocks using certain modules that it inherently provides. And as I mentioned, the DAC works at a clock rate of 100 megahertz. So, because each of these devices are working at different speeds as compared to the others, we need to be able to ensure smooth data flow between these devices at these interfaces. So we introduce the use of buffers, which basically buffer data from the slower devices to transfer data to the faster devices, because the faster devices read at a much faster rate than the slower devices can actually get them. And like I said, the RF front end that we used in our system was the XCVR data card. This is a very crowded slide, I must say, but this basically shows the overview of the entire NCOFDM transceiver scheme. We'll be focusing on the transmitter part. So if you can see, I've color-coded these blocks. So the greens basically mean that they are implemented on the real-time controller, and the blues basically mean that they have been implemented on the FPGA hardware. So we can see that, I'll just run this through very quickly. So the data bits are generated based on the data bits are generated and modulated on the based on the modulation scheme that we choose. Here we've chosen a modulation scheme of QPSK, and the reference symbols for this OFDM system are generated in order to make the channel estimation easier at the receiver end. So we generate the reference symbols at the real-time controller, and we interleave the reference and data separately. And this block and this real-time module basically interfaces with the FPGA, and the data, that is OFDM symbols, are sent to the FPGA for further processing. And the processing within the FPGA is done, and the samples are now sent to the DAC at the requisite rate that I mentioned. So the time requirement here, like I said, is to generate 12 OFDM symbols every subframe duration. The subframe duration here is 1 millisecond. So the real-time module in the platform allows for such time-constrained design. So the platform allows for an implementation whose example I've just mentioned here. So this block basically represents a loop or a block which can be controlled via timing. So this block basically stands for the time critical loop, which is called according to the platform. So the time critical loop ensures that the execution of any block within this loop is constrained, or it ensures that the execution happens in the period specified at the control of the loop. So here we have specified a period of 1 millisecond because we are interested in generating 12 such OFDM symbols every millisecond, which is the subframe duration. And we can specify the priority of this block as well, and the processor core that it inherently uses. So this block basically allows for a time constrained execution of the blocks that we place within it. So the real-time module is basically very straightforward. Like I said, it just generates bits and sends modulated symbols to the FPGA. Now coming to the FPGA module, basically. So what are the sub-blocks that have been designed on the FPGA? So we've got the zero padding. I'll just explain what these blocks basically stand for. This flow just dictates the blocks that are present on the FPGA. So inherently, the blocks on the FPGA design are now clock driven. So basically, anything that works on the FPGA works on the FPGA clock, and they have to be ensured to complete within the specified clock cycles. So the sub-blocks in the FPGA, at least in an NCFDM scheme, say, they work on either a block-by-block basis or on a sample-by-sample basis. So there is such serial-to-parallel conversion of data within the FPGA. So because of such serial-to-parallel conversion, because certain blocks work on samples and certain blocks work on entire chunks of data, they need to be buffered onto FIFOs in order for the sub-blocks, ease of the sub-block reading of the data. So yeah.
Is this related to the word length of the FPGA architecture? Block size?
No, this is constrained with our design. So for example, the FFT. So it basically functions basically the FFT involves FIFO within itself, because it has to accept 2048 length data and then perform the FFT and then send out on a sample basis. So because this block, which is following the FFT, works on a sample by sample basis, and this one works on a block by block basis. So there has to be a FIFO inbuilt within the FFT block, which basically makes sure that the data is gotten at the chunk rate and then sent out on a sample by sample basis. So we need to employ these FIFOs within the block.
Which FPGA platform did you use?
So this platform basically houses two Vertex 5s.
Vertex 5.
Yeah. So
How about preamble? Do you add that or is it part of? I'm not sure whether you use preambles or not.
PM isn't for
preamble, do you have that?
isn't
I'm just asking.
maybe if I go into these blocks again, I'll explain each of these blocks in detail. So this is basically how the data flows in the FPGA. So each OFDM symbol, as I said, basically contains 1200 subcarriers as specified by the LTE standard, and we are generating 12 of these OFDM symbols in every subframe duration. So the RT module has to basically send out 1200 into 12 complex samples. So the units for each of these rates are complex samples per millisecond. So the RT module has to basically make sure that that rate data symbols are sent to the FPGA module. So the zero padding block basically has pads zeros onto this symbol, because the FFT size that we're using here is 2048, and the number of subcarriers within an OFDM symbol here is 1200. So it needs to pad the requisite number of zeros to increase the length to 2048. So that block basically just does the zero padding for this purpose, and the output of that block hence now has a longer length sequence, or the number of subcarriers within the OFDM symbol is now increased to 2048, and we have 12 such OFDM symbols in every subframe duration. So that is the requisite rate for that block's functioning. So next block here is basically doing the selection for the time windowing and the carrier cancellation that I mentioned during the discussion of the IPFT system. So this block is again just selecting the requisite tones that are needed for processing the time windowed and the carrier cancelled schemes. So again, this block accepts data at certain rate and outputs at the same rate, because it is not increasing the length of the OFDM symbol in any way. So here in the IFFT scheme, so this block basically converts the symbols to time domain samples. So it is performing an IFFT, and the size of our IFFT is 2048. So and like I said, we use a cyclic prefix length of 512. So this block basically performs the IFFT and adds the cyclic prefix as well. So basically the output of this block is now a longer length sequence. So now the number of subcarriers within a single OFDM symbol is now increased to 2560. And 12 of these OFDM symbols within a subframe stand for 30,720 mega samples per second, which is basically dictated by the LTE standard. So this time windowing block here accepts these time domain samples, performs the pulse shaping for the time windowing mechanism, and the output again is of the same rate because it is not increasing the length of the sequence in any way. Now the crucial part here is that this block is basically interfacing with the DAC. The DAC now works at a rate of 50 megahertz, that is 50,000 complex samples per millisecond, as the rate mentions there. So now, and the data rate at which we are going currently is at 30.72 megasamples per second, or 30,720 samples per millisecond. So this rate has now is now to be upsampled to the rate that the DAC accepts data at. So we have an arbitrary resampler module which basically accepts this 30.72 megasamples per second, upsamples it by a ratio of about 1.6. And now the output of this block is now 50,000 complex samples per millisecond. So if you see that the rate of data flowing through the FPGA is constantly increasing. So this means that these data rates dictate the functioning, dictate the time constraints within each of these sub-blocks. So, and we know that each of these sub-blocks work on a clock basis, and now these data rates are now placing constraints on the functioning of these sub-blocks. So we will now discuss as to how exactly these timing constraints affect the design.
So before you do that, how does your arbitrary resampler work?
So
How does your arbitrary resampler function? How does that perform as task?
So it interpolates with a certain rate and it accepts data at whatever rate and does some processing where it interpolates and increases the rate.
It interpolates and it does it pick it up. So we'll talk more about that later.
Yeah. So when we are talking about design on FPGA, we are basically now constrained with timing and space on the FPGA itself, FPGA board itself. So space constraints can relatively easily be overcome by using an efficient FPGA module such as the Vertex 5. However, in a design, as long as we make sure that we do not include a large lookup tables on the FPGA modules, we can take care of the space constraints. So that one way to do it is to pre-allocate these data arrays outside of the FPGA and use FIFOs for sending the data onto the FPGA. So like I said in the previous slide, the data rates of each of these sub-blocks are basically dictating the functioning of each of these sub-blocks. So, and as we saw that these rates are increasing through the flow of the design in the FPGA. So each sub-block within the FPGA has its own data rate, which is constantly increasing because of the increase in the length of the OFDM symbols and the number of samples as well. So because these blocks are functioning at different clock rates as dictated by the data rate, some blocks need to stall their execution because of lack of available valid data points from the previous block. So, like for instance, the IFFT block is basically performing a very complex complex math function. So it inherently needs more clock cycles for functioning. So it basically works on a multi-cycle basis. So it employs a latching mechanism which basically stores data for one clock cycle for future functioning within the block itself. So one of the ways to avoid any timing delays that could occur within the FPGA because of these different clock rates of each of these sub-blocks is to utilize the parallel processing advantages of pipeline-based design. So if you've got three sub-blocks which are basically functioning together, so instead of having a single sub-block hogging the entire clock time, we can ensure by pipelining that there are three sub-blocks which are basically functioning at the same clock cycle. So one way to do this is, so suppose here the first sub-block here receives a valid input from the previous block. at the first clock cycle. But the second two sub-blocks here haven't yet received any valid inputs. So they now process with a default input that is provided to them via some control signals. And these function at that clock cycle as well. Now in the second clock cycle, the second block has now received a valid input, which is coming from the first sub-block. Because each of these sub-blocks are basically sequential, one after the other. So now they are functioning in parallel. So in the second clock cycle, the second sub-block, which is following the first one, has now received a valid input from the first sub-block, and so on. In the third clock cycle, all the three sub-blocks have basically received valid inputs from the previous sub-blocks at the third clock cycle. So this basically increases the throughput of the FPGA implementation. And in our case, this becomes crucial because, like I said, each of these sub-blocks are now sequential, working in sequence. And if we can have them work by making use of the parallel processing advantages, we can have such a scheme implemented. When we are talking about pipelining, we basically need to have some strict control mechanisms for each of these sub-blocks, which make sure that they receive valid inputs and generate valid outputs at every clock cycle. So one way to do this is use a very efficient handshaking protocol, which basically manages the control logic for the flow within the FPGA. So one technique for handshaking basically is the 4-wire protocol. I'll just explain what the 4-wire protocol means. So the 4-wire protocol just stands for 4 control signals that are employed within the FPGA. So they are called the input valid, the ready for output, output valid, and the ready for input. So what the input valid flag or basically means is that the input that the system has currently received is a valid new data point. So for example, here in our case, I've just taken the example of the zero padding block and the IFFT block. So if the zero padding block receives a valid input at the first clock cycle, then this flag is turned on, which means that the data point that it received is valid and processing can be continued. So once the processing is done, the output valid flag is raised, which means that the processing is complete and the valid output, the data output point is now valid and can be sent downstream to the subsequent blocks. So once the output valid is turned on, the data flows from the previous block onto the next block, which again turns on the input valid flag here, which means that the new data point has been received. Similarly, when processing within a block is complete, so the ready for output flag now turns on, which means that it has finished processing one particular data point and it is ready to output the next data point. So again, those control signals are basically used in both cases. So once the processing by each block is complete and it is waiting for the next valid data point, then it sends another flag, which it raises another flag which says ready for input. So this ready for input is basically communicating with the previous blocks via latching mechanism, because each of these blocks will be functioning at different clock rates, and this latch basically holds on to the data on for one more clock cycle, so that in that clock cycle this block finishes execution. So once the ready for input flag is raised and it is communicated to the previous block, the next valid data point is sent to the block for processing.
So Abhishek, quick question. Is there a way you can measure how long it takes to compute that IFFT? Well, we don't know really.
It is happening internally, so
You don't know.
No, there is no. I mean, maybe there is a benchmarking tool.
So how do you make sure that the host doesn't overflow the buffer, right?
So we keep buffers at wherever necessary, and make sure with some more control logic within these blocks, which make sure that there is no.
I mean to the host, right?
Yeah, so there is another FIFO which handles that as well, and again control logic there, which basically ensures that there is no underflow or overflow.
Do you have handshaking between the FPGA and the host to?
So there is a control logic which
handles
handles.
the data rate.
Yeah, there is. So yeah, so again, like I said, the time constraints here basically mean that the data has to be sent to the FPGA. Like I mentioned, there are the 1 millisecond period, right?
Yes.
So it has to, no matter what, send data onto the FPGA within that time period. If that doesn't happen, then there is underflow or overflow. So this basically concludes the design and implementation. Now, moving on to the experimentation platform. So this is the earlier implementation, like I've said earlier. So we used USRP2 with the following programming environment, and this experimentation was basically performed on the Orbit test bed. And this was the this is the plot which was generated from the data points collected from the USRP2 secondary receiver. This was so this basically this region here denotes the notch, and we've compared the NCFDM and the IAPFT schemes. Both were implemented on the USRP2 for the secondary, and we can see that the suppression within the notch is about 10 dB here, and those two tones that you see are basically the carrier cancellation. So this bit error rate curve evaluates the primary receiver versus increasing primary transmit amplitude. So this PR curve was basically present in our paper, which got accepted and published. So this again, these BER curves are basically characterizing the primary receiver, and we are doing this with both NCFDM and IAPFT, and we can see that the IAPFT performs better when it comes to error performance as opposed to normal NCFDM transmission.
So the pluses, the red pluses, are they the outliers for how large or small it could be?
Outlier.
So how many data points or how many bits were you using in doing these calculations, measurements?
I'm not sure about the number correctly. This is like about a year ago.
Okay.
So I'm not sure about the number of data points that we used exactly.
You say somewhere these are USRP results, right?
Yeah, these are USRP.
I'm saying in the slide.
So here, this basically is for the USRP. Yeah. Now is the second improvement. So this is the second platform, which is basically using the NI real-time controller, and this is just summarizing the platform as I discussed earlier. So one advantage of such a platform basically is the LabVIEW programming language allows for a graphical programming medium, which makes system architecture a lot easier than code based, because we can just translate our system architecture blocks onto the programming language via the exact same blocks that it provides.
So that FPGA is also the Vertex 5.
Yeah, the LabVIEW FPGA basically is used to program the Vertex 5. So I have a backup slide for that. So instead of writing a VHDL code for programming the FPGA, this provides some ready libraries which allows for a graphical medium to program the FPGAs. And the Xilinx compiler compiles this programming language onto the bit stream and loads it onto the FPGA. So this is again a spectrogram of the data points that are collected from the National Instruments platform. This was plotted in MATLAB with the IAPFT. So here again we notice a suppression of about 10 dB. So this was with the complex samples collected from the real-time platform receiver. So this slide just shows how this programming environment allows us for representing the spectrogram as a ready panel on the LabVIEW platform. So this is a screenshot of the spectrogram on the front panel of the LabVIEW programming interface. So this is basically the NCFDM transmission. So we have the availability of plotting the constellation for the secondary receiver as well on the platform. So these two screenshots basically show this is just concentrating on within the notch itself. So here we can see that there is no primary transmission occurring within the notch, and this is just a secondary NCFDM transmission. And this is the constellation for this here. And you can see that the notches are basically denoted by the zeros at the center on the constellation. Now with the introduction of the primary transmitter within the notch, we can see on the constellation clearly how it affects. So we can see that the notch at the center is now disturbed because of the presence of the primary. And this primary can be, the performance of this receiver can be basically characterized by increasing primary transmission. So here we can see that without the primary there is a perfect notch at the center, and here with a relatively large primary transmit amplitude of say 0.4 relative amplitude is now the constellation goes completely off because the receiver is now not able to discern between the two signals. So this is now with an even higher primary transmit amplitude, just to denote how the receiver basically performs when there is a very large primary transmitter within the notch. So you can see that it's completely off, and detection in such cases becomes near impossible. So this was using the data points that were collected on the real-time platform. So we have done only the NCFDM transmission here. So we have characterized the secondary NCFDM receiver with increasing primary transmit path. We can see that with increase in the primary transmit path, the error performance degrades, and for a relatively larger primary transmit amplitude, we have a very bad error performance of the secondary receiver. So this is basically what the secondary receiver sees.
Interesting how you decide to change your scales from standard approach.
That was
for protocols.
no that. Actually, what happened was that was a requirement earlier when we did the USRP based for the paper. So NEC had requested for a certain
Website.
Yeah, something like that. So we had to change it, and I just used the same here.
Sure.
So this is just concluding this work basically. So like I said, we've implemented the secondary NCFDM transceiver, and now this platform can be used as a benchmark for future design because it's robust enough and it's a real-time hardware-based implementation. This implementation was then integrated for DSA-based experiments, and we've performed DSA experiments, and we've observed the suppression as denoted by the plots earlier, and we evaluated the secondary receiver's performance in the presence of the primary transmitter. I'd like to thank whoever I've worked with over this course of this project. Firstly, I have to thank Professor Fredrak for the support throughout, and most of the WinLab students who assisted or who guided me throughout this project's course. Thank you.